Okay, discussion order. If I could turn your attention to Stacy Exhibit 436. It's on the screen. If you could step down, she's got a question on it.
Yes, you missed it.
And using the pointer that's still in this wall in the back there. You're asked by the defense attorney questions with respect to the waistband of the DKNY brand machines. You recall that yesterday? And part of the questions was had to do with the frequency estimates that you conducted using some of the information that you were able to, I guess, get through DNA testing with respect to that particular item. Can you recall that? Now, you also testified that pursuant to the protocols or the guidelines set forth in the laboratory within the Honolulu Police Department, you take the conservative approach. Is that correct?
Conservative in the sense that we calculate our frequency estimates with 7 different databases. So there's 7 different population groups that were chosen to represent the diversity point. Those databases are Caucasian, Black, Southwest Hispanic, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and Vietnamese. So we'll run the frequency estimates through all those different databases, and we'll report out only the most common or conservative results.
And when you say the most common or conservative results, can you explain what you mean by when you use those terms, the most common or most conservative results?
So basically, it's going to be the lowest number.
And in this case, when you're trying to, although you testified yesterday that both Carly Scott as well as Stephen Capobianco, they both had 15 out of 15 identifiers or locations, is that correct?
So the terminology we use is concordance.
I'm sorry, concordance. And,
But you can object. I think that illustrates the testimony. And it's very.
so she just corrected the term.
The objection is
Thank you. Now, 15 out of 15 concordance, but you also testified you did not use all of those markers or numbers in determining the frequency estimate. Is that correct?
Correct. I believe I used 6 out of 13 to calculate the frequency estimates.
And then you also mentioned that that was a conservative. Did you say that was a conservative approach using 6 out of the 13?
That's what it is.
That means something.
Is that an objection?
Yes, Your Honor.
I'll also state that if it's something different, maybe you should rephrase your question.
Okay. Why did you use 6 out of the 13?
So when we calculate our frequency estimates, when it comes to mixtures, we eliminate any of the genetic locations that show a low-level result. So again, this is the genetic characteristics that have an asterisk next to it. So we would not utilize anything that has an asterisk indicated on a genetic characteristic in a mixture for the frequency estimates.
And according to your testimony, how would you characterize that approach using 6 out of 13?
So I guess you would consider a conservative approach to not utilize every single location.
And what would be an approach that you would consider not conservative?
Well, for our laboratory, the policy is that we're only going to calculate frequency estimates for mixtures for samples that do not show any low-level results at any genetic locations.
If you were to calculate mixtures or low-level results, would that have affected the frequency estimate number?
Your Honor, I'm going to object on the 16. This gets into a whole different area. these kind of calculations are not, to my knowledge, are not done on this for procedures and protocols, essentially. So he's asking to, and if you lack a foundation, then we're asking to speculate.
You know, it wouldn't be speculation on her part based on her training, experience, and education. She could.
Well, let's do this. I'll sustain the objection and let's get more foundation so that that's clear. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Based on your training, your experience, and your education in this area with respect to, I guess, determining frequency estimates, would you be able to, without speculating and also without giving us an exact number, would you be able to tell us whether or not, if you're to include the low levels, whether that would affect the frequency estimate number that was provided in this case?
Same objection, Your Honor.
And that's a foundational question.
I'll overrule the objection to this foundation.
Would you be able to tell us whether or not that would affect the frequency estimate numbers?
So in general, when we're calculating frequency estimates, the more genetic mutations that we utilize for those calculations, the higher the number is obtained.
So it would affect the number.
Yes.
I'll take it. And thinking of discussion more, I have no further questions. Thank you.
With respect to that last question, there's a reason you do not use the numbers with the abstracts, correct?
It's our policy not
No,
to.
I'm sorry, I did have one last question before that sense. It's just a follow-up question.
All right, go ahead.
Last question, discussion more than anything, just testify to, is it within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, pursuant to your education, training, or observations? Thank you, no further questions.
Yes, Mr. Hartman,
I'll withdraw that last question. You would agree that using the numbers of the asterisks in your calculation to violate the procedures and protocols of the lab firm in which you work at, is that correct?
Correct, it's our policy not to utilize those.
Now, you are involved in the generation of 3 reports, right?
Yes.
The first was prepared March 3rd, 2014.
Yes.
And that report documents your conclusions on testing of 4 swabs taken from the black rock,
Yes.
20 swabs taken from nails,
Yes.
toothbrush,
Yes.
and the tissue from the lower right jawbone.
Yes.
Second report was prepared in September of 2015, a little less than a year later.
September 9, 2015, yes.
And that report involved the testing of black jeans,
Yes.
gray sweatshirt,
Yes.
black rock,
Yes.
swab marked from a phone front and side,
Yes.
swab from back of phone,
Yes.
2 swabs identified as coming from Mr. Capobianco,
Yes.
a pair of blue jeans,
Yes.
and 5 swabs which are all marked in regards with an indication that they came from the jeans.
It's 4.
4 swabs. Well, the swab from the waistband was 2 swabs, is that correct?
Correct.
And if you count that as 2 independent swabs, it would be 5.
Yes.
Now, those 5, you also on the blue jeans, which is your identifier, SD01261, you took 5 samples from that, is that correct? That's 6 samples. Or, yeah, 6 samples.
So the blue jeans DKNY brand marked as SD01261.
Yes,
A total of 5 samples were tested.
5 samples. And those are separate from the 5 swabs you got that indicated they came from the jeans, right?
Yes.
Now, the first time you were provided with the blue jeans or any swabs allegedly taken from the blue jeans was in July, I believe July 7th, 2015.
So in regards to the blue jeans DKNY brand. I received those July 7th, 2015.
And when I say blue jeans, I'm going to be referring just to those jeans. Now, I noticed when you were handling the bag in which those were contained yesterday, it had blue tape on it. Was that blue tape on it when you received them?
I don't recall. I'll have to look at it again.
Okay. Do you know what blue tape signifies?
No, I have the seals that I put on are yellow. I'll have to examine it again to see.
Your second report reflects the testing of 3 samples from the black bra. By second report, it was September 9th, 2015.
Repeat the question, please.
Your second report, the one dated September 9th, 2015, that reflects your conclusions regarding testing of 3 samples from the black bra.
So, the report dated September 9th, 2015 is a continuation report. So, it does have some of the samples from the previous report conclusions that we reported.
No. You, on your first report, March 3rd, 2014, you tested 4 swabs that were reported to have come from a black bra, correct?
Correct.
And in your second report, the one dated September 9th, 2015, you tested 3 samples from the black bra, correct?
Correct.
The 4 samples that are reflected in your March 3rd, 2014 report are not the same as the 3 samples in your September 9th, 2015 report, correct?
That is correct.
And you prepared a 3rd report?
Yes.
And that was January of 2016?
January 8th, 2016, yes.
And that reflects the testing of the green blanket?
Yes.
You testified when you test for blood, you use 2 types of tests, is that correct?
That is correct.
And what are those 2 types?
So the 2 tests that we use, the first one's called Hemident. It's a chemical test that's testing for the presence of blood. The second test that we utilize is a biological test called Hematrace, and that is designed to detect blood of human origin.
Are they equally as sensitive?
They're about as sensitive. They're about equally sensitive.
Now, in every item you tested for blood, you use both those tests?
Correct.
Why do you use 2 different tests?
So the first reason is because that's part of our procedures. We have to utilize those 2 tests. But more specifically, there are 2 types of tests, right? So Hemident is a chemical-based test, where Hematrace is a biological-based test. So biological meaning we're dealing with proteins. Proteins may degrade easier than a non-protein. So in conjunction, we're trying to get the best result as possible.
Is it fair to say the higher number of individuals who contribute to a DNA profile, the harder it is to interpret?
So in regards to mixed DNA profiles, the higher the number, I would agree to that.
And now, and we talked about it yesterday, when we're looking at those 15 or 16 locations, each one of those locations, what's the scientific term for that?
So the scientific term for the genetic locations is, the symbol is locus, plural is loci.
And it's alleles that you're looking at a particular locus, and that's what's represented by those numbers we saw on the chart.
And so alleles are what I've been referring to as the genetic characteristics, and those are the numbers that are represented on the charts.
Now, at each given locus tested, there's a limited range, and therefore a limited number of different alleles within that range. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say.
Okay, so for example, is Thal1, is that the name of one of the locus you looked at?
Yes.
And at Thal1, the alleles that have been observed are limited to a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8, a 9, a 9.3, a 10, and an 11. Is that correct?
I would have to look at what we call the allele ladder, and that displays common alleles for that specific genetic location. It's not the entirety of what can be observed, but that's what's included in our specific kit that we're testing for.
Would you agree at thou 1, though, for example, you've never seen a 19?
I would have to review data.
Would you agree if it even exists, it's extremely uncommon?
I would have to look at the ladder, and most of the time, an allele is going to fall within that ladder range.
Okay. And do you have the ladder here?
No, I don't.
Can you explain what expectation bias is?
Expectation bias in regards to
DNA testing?
more specific.
Is it appropriate to know the results of a known sample before testing a piece of evidence to see if it matches that sample, the known sample?
So our policy is that you should examine the question sample first, make your conclusions on that sample, meaning is it a single source, is it a mixture, and what genetic characteristics are within that profile. At that point, if there's no reference samples, then you would make the comparison.
And you would agree that that is sound scientific procedure?
Yes?
And why?
I guess you don't want to make assumptions. You want to look at the question profile for what it is without looking at any known profiles. And you don't want to assume a contributor before you actually make all the comparisons and conclusions.
Now, you received the gray sweatshirt on May 7th, 2014, correct?
That is correct.
And you received Mr. Capobianco's buccal swab samples on March 16, 2015, correct?
That is correct.
And you received the blue jeans on July 7, 2015, correct?
That is correct.
Now, when you're interpreting your results, and can we agree that your conclusions are fairly described as interpretations?
Yes.
And are you looking at peaks? Is that fair to say?
So at the raw data, it's visualized as peaks, and it's translated into those numbers that you see.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit about what these peaks are?
So the instrument that we utilize, it processes a sample and it translates the genetic characteristics at the different genetic locations into peaks. The peaks are labeled with the number that we report.
And some peaks can be caused by what is known as artifacts. Is that fair to say?
Yes?
And artifacts or peaks or other abnormalities on the data that are not attributable to DNA actually present on that item. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And artifacts can result from non-allelic product that is generated during the amplification process.
That's correct.
And also result from anomalies in the detection process.
That's correct.
And artifacts can also be the byproduct of primer synthesis.
Correct.
And stutter is a common artifact,
That is correct.
which is different from any of the other artifacts I just mentioned.
Well, it's one of the artifacts that we may visualize when we're examining our data.
And artifacts are well documented and routinely observed in DNA testing. Is that correct?
It's fair to say.
Now, in obtaining this frequency calculations, is the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium relied on?
So that's part of the foundation for the frequency estimates.
Okay, and what is that?
I don't know if I can accurately explain it at this time. It's part of the calculations that's encompassed within the software program that we use, the PopStats.
And that equilibrium theory or model, it makes certain assumptions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And one of those assumptions is that you're working off of infinitely large population?
Without reviewing, I wouldn't be able to answer.
Is it one of the assumptions that mating is random?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer.
We talked about this a little bit, but the lab at which you work sets thresholds which must be met before a peak can be considered a reliable indicator of a DNA profile.
There are thresholds that we utilize during our analysis.
And you would agree that the validity and reliability of the work that comes from a particular laboratory is dependent on the setting of thresholds and protocols.
Can you repeat the question?
Would you agree that the validity and reliability of test results from a particular lab are dependent on the establishment and following of certain thresholds?
The objection is not relevant as far as our listeners are concerned.
The objection is through the answer session.
So the thresholds are set by each laboratory, and that's through validations. So I'm not quite sure
Well, the goal is to perform good science, correct?
exactly.
And those assist in the performance will be considered good science, is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
And peaks that fall under the threshold, those would be considered scientifically reliable, is that fair to say?
So in our laboratory, we have two thresholds. There's an analytical threshold, meaning anything below that level, we're not going to
I'm
interpret.
sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I just asked the question, would you agree that to use peaks that are under the threshold set by the protocols would be considered scientifically unreliable?
Under the analytical threshold.
Okay, thanks.
I do object on discussion when I was finished answering the question.
The objection is sustained.
Can you explain what an analytical threshold?
No, finish answering the question. She was
Yes, I'll sustain the objection. You may
Thank you.
complete your answer.
Okay, so as I was saying, our laboratory utilizes two different thresholds. There's what we call an analytical threshold. So anything that we see below that threshold, we're not going to use, we're not going to interpret, we're not going to report. The other threshold that we have is called a stochastic threshold. So this threshold's higher, but it's where we would indicate. So when you see the asterisk next to a genetic characteristic, that's indicating a genetic characteristic that's within the stochastic threshold, meaning we see it and it's at a low level. We're marking it because it's at a low level, we don't know if we're seeing the entirety of the profile. So it's a flag for the analyst.
And things like drop-off do occur, correct?
Dropouts?
Dropout?
Yes.
And what is dropout?
So again, it would be in relation to what I just mentioned. There's a possibility that you may see part of a profile, but not in its entirety. So you may be missing part of the profile.
Now, peaks can result from background noise, is that fair to say?
Peaks, yes.
And background noise is something that's going to be present at all laboratories conducting DNA testing.
The background
No
noise.
objection, that calls for speculation. If we reverse to all of the first.
Your Honor, I think this is pretty well documented.
I probably sustain the objection. If you want to ask about this lab, that would be fine. But I think beyond that, unless there's some foundation, it would be speculative.
Okay, now you already mentioned that your protocols require you to conduct 2 blood tests every time you conduct a blood test.
Yes,
correct?
we utilize the two kits.
And is it fair to say that someone who conducts DNA testing at the Honolulu lab in which you work, it is important for you to be aware of the procedures and protocols?
Yes.
And so is it fair to say you keep informed to any changes in procedures and protocols?
For our laboratory?
Yes.
Yes, we're informed of any changes.
Okay. And it's important for everybody who handles any evidence in your lab to be aware and to follow the procedures and protocols, correct?
Yes, I would agree to that.
And in fact, if you became aware that somebody had breached a protocol, that's something you would document in your report, correct?
Breaching a protocol, can you be more specific?
With handling of the evidence.
There would be documentation somewhere at some point if somebody realized it.
Okay. Are you aware of any changes in procedures or protocols at the Honolulu lab where you work that occurred after you produced your first report, in this case, March 3rd, 2014, specifically in relation to the access to the lab or the storage areas?
Changing procedures?
Yes.
No.
Was there a change in enforcement?
Can you be more specific?
Was there an issue, again, that has changed since your first report till now with regards to propping open doors?
Propping
Judge,
open
no, I'm
doors?
sorry, no, I do object at this point if it's vague and ambiguous as far as from your first report till now.
The objection is sustained.
Well, would you agree that in the last 2 years, there has been concerns regarding the procedures surrounding the locked storage evidence?
Your objections calls for speculation because there's no foundation.
Your Honor, this is part of the procedures and protocols.
The objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
Can you repeat it, please?
Yes. Would you agree in the last 2 years, there has been concern regarding access to the evidence vault at the lab in which you work?
It's an
Specifically,
objection that calls for speculation.
The
There's no
objection is
foundation.
sustained.
Thank you.
Would
You
you
need to
be,
rephrase your question.
would you agree that the procedures and protocols that were in place in with respect to any possible issue of access to the lab in which you work by unauthorized personnel, has anything changed in the last 2 years?
Judge, again, that is vague and ambiguous.
The objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
can you repeat it, please?
With respect to the last 2 years, has anything changed at the lab in which you work in Honolulu regarding access to the evidence storage locker by unauthorized personnel?
In the forensic biology laboratory, can I explain the setup?
I think it's kind of a simple question.
No.
Nothing has changed?
Hold on, Your Honor, that's unfair to Ms. Kashimoto. She has an answer she needs to answer.
I believe she's, when it says it's kind of a simple question, she's said no. I believe it was not in response to the question, but in response to your remark, or question of whether it was a simple question. Let's try this again because it's getting rather confusing.
Would you agree, well, let me ask you this, would you agree that propping open doors that would allow access by unauthorized personnel into the lab you work would violate the procedures and protocols of your laboratory?
So propping open the laboratory door.
Judge, I do object. That's a unclear, confusing, ambiguous hypothetical if that's proposed as a hypothetical.
I'll sustain the objection.
Thank you.
You are going to need to get some clarification concerning
Okay.
the
Would
question.
you agree, okay, how are the doors currently, how is the facility made secure currently?
Okay.
And when I say facility, I'm talking about the lab at which you work.
Okay, so specifically the forensic biology laboratory, and that's the unit that I work in. The laboratory itself, all the keys, or all the doors have key access. That key access is limited to the personnel that work in that specific lab, so all the criminalists that are assigned to the forensic biology lab, and the supervisors. Those are the only individuals that have key access to the laboratory doors. There's an alarm system also that's activated when we shut down the lab for the day.
Now, if one of the doors to the lab was propped open, that would defeat the key system. Is that fair to say?
I should also remark that within this secure laboratory that has key access, we have what we call the evidence vault. That is another door that has key access. And that, again, that's limited to the individuals that I mentioned prior. So,
And both of the access door and the evidence storage vault, you would agree that those doors, that the security systems would be defeated if those doors were propped open. Is that fair to say?
And again, I object because that's an unfair hypothetical, too broad and it's too general.
The objection is over.
so what we're concerned about, obviously, is the security of the evidence that's being analyzed. It is our procedures and protocols that whenever somebody is analyzing evidence, they have to remain with that evidence. If not, it has to be either within a sealed package or placed in another secure location, which is an evidence locker, which only that individual who places the evidence in would have access to. There should never be a time when somebody has evidence out and they're not next to it and making sure that it is secure.
Would you agree that those doors were not always secured in 2014?
And unless you have personal knowledge, it's called for speculation, and it's too
The,
broad.
I'll overrule the objection with the understanding that that's asking if she does have personal knowledge of that.
So I don't recall ever having either of those doors propped open at the same time. There may be an instance when one or the other may be propped open. For instance, the exterior laboratory door, and for transporting items of evidence or supplies that we need to, that may be bulky, we may prop open the door in order to get it in there. In regards to the evidence vault door, if it's propped open, from my knowledge, it's normally, again, if you're transporting bulky items of evidence, you don't want the door closing on you.
Okay. However, so at times these doors are propped open.
Your objection, that's too broad.
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Would you agree that with respect to propping open doors, though, there have been changes within what's allowable within your lab after after March 3rd, 2014?
I'm not aware of any changes in policies.
What about enforcement of policies?
Well, it was my understanding that those doors should remain closed unless there's situations where somebody is only propping it open for a short period of time. So again, what we're concerned about is the security of evidence. And what I spoke about before, the evidence is always with the individual that's testing it, or it's secured within its packaging, sealed, or it's in an evidence locker, or it's in the evidence vault, sealed.
Would you agree that after March 3rd, 2014, however, an independent audit raised concerns regarding
Judge,
the
I
property
object.
open of the doors?
First of all, that's a statement that calls for speculation. It's hearsay. There's no basis and there's no foundation for this.
I'll sustain the objection. I'll allow questions as to whether or not any doors were propped open while with respect to the evidence in this case, but if we're going beyond that, then that would not be relevant to this particular case. So if you want to pursue any questions concerning propping
Thank
doors
you.
open, you need to start. While this evidence was being secured or tested.
The request for DNA testing on the swabs taken from the nail in the bra was made on February 21st, 2014, correct?
So the request
Yes.
was received February 21st, 2014.
And the analysis was performed and a report generated about 10 days later, a little bit more on March 3rd, 2014.
Yeah, so the analysis would have been performed within that time period.
And again, the second report, September 9th, 2015, correct?
Yes.
And you had been in personal possession of some of the evidence documented in your September ninth report, such as the gray sweatshirt, for more than a year before generating that report. Is that fair to say?
Yes,
In the first report, you document the testing from a jawbone tissue,
in the first report.
March 3rd, 2014.
Yes, I tested tissue, described an item described as tissue from lower right jawbone.
Okay, but you failed to obtain a DNA profile from that tissue?
Correct, no DNA profile was obtained.
You can get DNA from teeth, correct?
We don't do that in our laboratory.
The question was, though, you can get DNA from teeth.
I've heard that it is possible to get
Okay, then
DNA
you're
from
an
teeth.
architect, because this is speculation.
The objection is sustained.
Are you
It's
spec-
Mr. Strike and as well as
Motion is
the
granted.
answer. Thank you.
you said that you're in charge of distributing the publications at the lab you work?
So for what we call our journal club, or at this time I am responsible for going through the journals and assigning the readings to the other analysts.
Would you agree that obtaining DNA from teeth is well researched and documented?
Yes,
And it's possible, correct?
yes it is.
And it's not from the enamel, it's from the inside of the tooth,
It's
correct?
from within the tooth.
So if I'm touching my tooth, I'm touching the enamel, correct?
So it's within, so it'd be the tooth pulp, I believe.
So it's protected from environmental conditions?
Correct.
Now the 20 swabs from the fingernails, you tested each one individually?
So there was two sets. 10 swabs from the nails marked distal and 10 swabs from the nails marked proximal. So those two were separate. Let me just confirm. Okay, so a portion of each of the 10 swabs from the nails marked distal was taken as a sample, and a portion of each of the 10 swabs from the nails marked proximal were taken as a sample.
And so when you say a portion, does that mean they're all tested together?
So if there's 10 swabs, so not more than half of each swab would be taken.
Okay. And distal is the part you trim, correct?
I'm not correct, I didn't write the evidence report, so I'm not familiar with the description.
Now, the profile that you identified in the nail, and which is consistent with the profile identified in the toothbrush, it's your opinion that in a group of 2.259 quadrillion people, you'd only expect to see that profile once?
So my conclusion with the frequency estimate for that sample was that using the most conservative frequency estimate, approximately 2.259 quadrillion unrelated individuals would have to be evaluated before expecting to find an individual who would have a DNA profile that cannot be excluded.
And if you were looking at people who were related, that number would be far less, correct?
In our laboratory, we only calculate for unrelated individuals.
Are you aware of whether or not related people would be more likely to share common alleles?
That would be an accurate statement.
Now, your report says the profile from the from the nail had 12 of 13 of the STR loci present, correct?
No, what that statement is, it says this calculation is based on 12 of the 13 CODIS core STR loci.
Right, and you had tested 15 loci though, right?
Correct.
And that number is based on 14 out of 15 being present, correct? The 2.259
It's based on the calculation of 12.
on 12. Okay. Do you know what the number would be if all 15 loci matched?
No, I didn't calculate that.
Okay. Do you know approximately how many people there are in the United States?
In the United States, no.
The world?
The world, I believe it's approximately 7.5 billion.
So far under 1 quadrillion, right?
I would say a quadrillion far exceeds the population of the planet.
Okay. Now, you testified that the statistical frequencies you rely on, and which reference quadrillions, is generated by the FBI?
Yes.
And how many, if we're talking 1 quadrillion, how many zeros behind the 1 are there?
There are 15 zeros.
15 zeros. Now, between your first report, March 3rd, 2014, and your third report, January of 2016, you received notification from the FBI that their statistical frequencies needed to be adjusted?
So that was May of 2015 that the FBI sent out a notification.
So it was essentially our numbers were wrong, update it with the revised numbers.
The objection is to the calculation of the numbers being wrong. That's argumentative.
The objection is sustained. You may rephrase your question.
You revised your calculations based on that notice, correct?
So I recalculated using the new software.
And that's what the FBI has requested that you do.
They didn't request that we do it. It was up to our technical leader, who's the head of the lab. So the FBI sent out a notice.
Would you agree, though, that it would not be good science to use the previous calculations in light of the notice provided to you by the FBI?
Yeah, so it was the laboratory technical leader. They told us that we need to reissue any frequency estimates if we're reporting out that we had previously reported. So we needed to update the frequency estimates, and that's incorporated in the September 9th, 2015 report.
Okay. Now, going back to the nail, do you know what the statistical frequency would be if 9 of the 13 loci were matched?
So in regards,
Going back to the nail, you said, I believe.
Yeah, objection, Your Honor. This, first it's unclear, it's ambiguous, and also, just right now it's unclear and ambiguous, which counsel is referring to.
The objection is sustained.
With regards to testing the nail, how many loci did you say matched?
Again, Your Honor, there's 2 sets of nails, and it's ambiguous which...
There's only one nail that had a profile. Is that fair to say?
so there's actually the swabs from the nails marked proximal. There was no interpretable DNA profile obtained. The swabs from the nail marked distal, there was a profile obtained from that sample.
Okay. Now, and how many loci matched on the one that you were able to obtain a profile?
So the terminology that we used, as far as when I made the comparison against the profile from the swabs from the nails marked distal to the reference sample, which was the toothbrush, which was the personal effect, or indicated as a personal effect of Carly Scott, there was 14 out of 15 was the concordance.
Do you know what the statistical frequency would have been if there was 9 out of 13?
No, I did not calculate that.
Are you aware of publications or research done in regards to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory convicted offender data bank that was searched in 2001?
No.
So you don't know of any of the profiles that they had within that convicted offender database?
Judge, objection, she's already testified that she does not know what he's referring to or hasn't reviewed it. So any other questions?
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Right? Even your second report, the September 9th, 2015, you tested a can of pepper spray, is that correct? Or swabs that were labeled as having come from a can of pepper spray?
2 swabs from a mace pepper spray canister.
Okay. And no DNA was detected, correct?
Correct. Correct, no DNA profile was obtained.
And when I'm referring to your September 9th report is your second report.
Okay.
The second report, you also report your conclusions regarding swabs taken from a cellular phone, is that correct?
The description is as a phone, swab marked front and side of phone, swab marked back of phone.
And so there were 2 swabs.
Yes,
And one of those swabs had no interpretable DNA, is that correct?
that is correct.
You found a partial profile on the other swab?
A partial DNA profile
And
consists.
Charlie Scott was excluded from that profile, correct?
So in regards to the swab mark from the back of the phone, a partial DNA profile consistent with a mixture of 2 or more individuals was obtained. Due to low levels of DNA, no conclusions were made regarding Stephen Capobianco, and Carly Scott was excluded as a possible contributor to that partial DNA mixture.
Thank you. The report generated on January 8th, 2016. You report the results from the testing of the green blanket.
Yes,
And that was 8 separate samples from the green blanket were tested.
that is correct.
And they're all tested for blood.
That is correct.
And not one of those tested positive for blood, correct?
No blood was detected on any of those 8 samples.
Did you try to obtain DNA from that blanket?
No, only blood testing was
Why
done.
didn't you try to obtain DNA?
The focus was on trying to determine if there was any blood stains on the blanket.
Who made that determination?
I believe it would have been a communication with the investigator.
So that wasn't your call?
Normally we work with the investigators to determine what type of testing is going to be done on an item.
Do you document who makes the final call?
Normally there is documentation.
Do you know who made the final call in that situation?
No, I don't recall.
And your second report, the one that's September 9th, 2015, you state your conclusions from the testing of a pair of black jeans.
The black jeans, yes.
And as a result of low levels, no conclusions were made, is that correct?
So there was 3 samples tested on the black jeans. The sample that was taken from the waistband, there was a partial DNA profile consistent with a mixture of 2 or more individuals. But due to low levels of DNA, no conclusions could be made against any of the known or reference samples that I tested.
Now with respect to the gray sweatshirt, 6 samples were tested, correct?
That is correct.
And 5 of those samples, which were kind of identified as SC83551-Q1 through Q5, all of those you tested for the presence of blood, correct?
That is correct.
And none of those tested positive for blood, correct?
No blood was detected on those samples.
And then there is one more sample at Q6, correct?
That is correct.
And that you employed a different procedure, you used the vacuuming?
So there was also a sample taken from the collar, armpit, and cuff areas of the gray sweater or sweatshirt, and that was using the vacuuming.
Okay. And you were able to obtain a profile from her?
Yes, so a partial DNA profile consistent with a mixture of 2 individuals was obtained from that sample.
Okay, so a mixture of 2.
Correct?
Okay, and Stephen Capobianco was excluded from that mixture?
My conclusions were that Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco were excluded as possible contributors to that partial DNA mixture.
And now, as we noted on your March 3rd, 2014 report, you tested the 4 swabs from the bra,
Correct?
and there is no detectable DNA on any of those swabs?
Correct. No DNA profiles obtained from any of those samples.
And also with respect to all 4 of those swabs, you tested each one for the presence of blood, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you did not detect any blood on all 4 of those swabs, correct?
That is correct.
And you utilized both those 2 tests, the hematite and the hematrace?
That is correct.
And again, as we said, you did an additional 3 tests on the bra that are reflected in your September 9th, 2015 report.
Yes, so 3 samples were taken from the black bra.
And those samples were prepared by you, correct?
Correct.
And the 4 samples that are reflected in your March 3rd, 2014 report, those samples were prepared by the Maui Police Department, correct?
Correct.
And so in total there would be 7 samples that were tested with regards to the black bra? 4 from the Maui Police Department, 3 you prepared?
Yeah, so I tested 4 swabs that were recovered from the bra, and then I tested the bra itself, 3 samples.
Okay. And you tested each one of those for the presence of blood, correct?
All but 1, I
All but
believe.
one.
Let me just double check. Yes, all but 1.
Okay, and did you test them all for DNA as well?
Yes.
And there was no blood detected on any of the ones you tested for blood, correct?
No blood was detected.
And there was no DNA profile on any of the ones, on any of those samples, correct?
There was no DNA profiles obtained from the samples that I took from the interior left and right breast cups. The sample that I took from the breast cups, the back straps, and the shoulder straps, there was a profile, but it was determined to be uninterpretable.
Okay. With respect to the blue jeans you tested, several of the swabs and cuttings contained a profile consistent with Charlie Scott's profile and excluded Stephen Capobianco's profile. Is that correct? I believe it would be SD01261-Q2, SD01261-Q3, SD01261-Q4, and SD01261-Q5.
For each of those samples, Stephen Capobianco was excluded.
And those are swabs or cuttings that were taken from the stained areas, correct?
That is correct.
Now, in addition to all of those, Maui Police Department appears to have also sent swabs from those blue jeans as well, which would be SD01281.
Yes.
Now, with respect to the samples sent to you by Maui Police Department, that I just asked you about, there is no blood detected on any of those samples, correct?
That is correct.
And they were tested for blood, correct?
Yes, I tested them for blood.
Also, with respect to the swabs from the blue jeans sent to you from Maui Police Department, you could not obtain a DNA profile from those swabs, correct?
There was either no interpretable DNA profile or no DNA profile obtained from those samples.
Now, the testing and analysis of the blue jeans left interior waist area that you sampled, that's SD01261-Q1, is that correct?
Correct.
I'm going to just refer to that as Q1, okay?
Okay.
You reported that the DNA profile obtained from Q1 is from 2 or more people, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, the black jeans, you just said a mixture of 2 people, correct?
So the black jeans in reference to the waistband.
Yes.
Yes, so my conclusion was a mixture. Wait, excuse me, sorry. The black jeans or the...
Yes, the black jeans.
So the black jeans, the sample that was taken from the waistband, my conclusion was a partial DNA profile consistent with a mixture of 2 or more individuals was obtained.
Okay. And again, the DNA profile you obtained from Q1 is from 2 or more, correct?
So Q1 in regards to the blue
Blue
jeans.
jeans, the waist.
Correct, the DNA profile obtained was consistent with a mixture of 2 or more individuals.
Okay. Would you agree that the DNA profile you obtained from Q1, the waistband, could have been deposited long before the DNA profiles you obtained from the stain part of the blue jeans?
Objection, that calls for speculation.
The objection is sustained.
Are you able to determine when DNA was deposited on the blue jeans pant leg?
No.
Similarly, are you able to determine when the DNA was deposited on the waistband?
No.
Are you able to determine whether the DNA deposited on the leg was deposited at the same time as the DNA on the waistband?
No.
So is it fair to say that you are unable to determine whether the DNA on the waistband was deposited before, after, or at the same time as the DNA deposited on the leg?
There's no way for us to determine when DNA was deposited on an item.
And an item that contains two separate DNA profiles, it is possible for those to have been deposited at two separate times, correct?
Objection, because again, these are possibilities, it calls for speculation.
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
If I gave you a towel to hold on to and to play with for an hour or so, you would agree that your DNA would likely be present on that towel thereafter?
Objection, Your Honor, again, this calls for speculation, whether or not it's likely to be on there.
The objection is sustained.
How would you go up, if I gave you a towel right now and you wanted to put your DNA profile on that towel, how would you go about doing that?
If you wanted me to transfer some of my DNA,
Correct.
probably the easiest way would be to spit on it.
Okay. And if you did that, and we were to put that towel away for a month, and then I was to take that towel and I was to spit on it, you would detect both of our DNA profiles on that towel. Is that fair to say?
I object because that's an incomplete and an unfair hypothetical.
The objection is over. Would you answer that question?
Can you repeat it?
Yeah. So if you spit on that towel, we put that towel away for a month, I took that towel, I spit on it, it's reasonably likely you would find both of our DNA profiles on that towel. Is that fair to say?
Depending on the location sampled.
But you would not be surprised to find both of our DNAs on that, profiles on that towel, correct?
If it was known that both you and I spit on the towel, no.
Right, and that'd be true even if we had never, if that was the only contact we had ever had with that towel, correct?
That's correct.
Now, with regards to Q1, the swab from the blue jeans, the waistband, is it reasonably possible that 3 or more people contributed to that DNA mixture?
So my conclusion was that it's consistent with a mixture of 2 or more. And the or more is the kicker because there is uncertainty in how many individuals may be present. So my conclusion is 2 or more.
Now, you did find, is it fair to call an allele that belonged to neither Charlie Scott nor Stephen Capobianco a foreign allele?
I wouldn't call it that.
What would you call it?
Because again, when I'm looking at a question item of evidence, there's no assumptions as to who the donor is, unless it's an intimate sample. So an intimate sample would be an item that is recovered directly from a person's body or within their body. You can assume that their DNA profile is going to be there. So then any other genetic characteristics that are accounted for in that individual's DNA profile, you can consider that a foreign DNA profile. When it comes to a question or unknown sample, it's just a genetic characteristic that's there. It's not necessarily a foreign.
Okay. But would you agree that on Q1 there were alleles present that belonged to neither Stephen Capobianco nor Charlie Scott?
So if I was to compare that DNA profile and make the assumption that those individuals donated their DNA, and I'm looking for anything that that's not consistent with either, can I just briefly look at my... Yes, so there are genetic characteristics that aren't associated to either of the individuals that I tested.
And now, on direct examination, you were asked about how environmental factors can cause degradation to a DNA profile. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And you were talking in generalities, correct?
yes,
You weren't making conclusions regarding why the low levels of DNA in some of the testing you performed in the instinct case, correct?
no,
And in fact, some of the samples, specifically Q3 and Q5 that you tested from the blue genes, you were able to obtain a complete profile, correct?
that is correct.
So in those profiles, it appeared that no degradation had occurred, correct?
I wouldn't necessarily be able to state that. I was able to obtain a DNA profile from that specific sample.
And a complete DNA profile.
Correct,
Now, DNA can be found on cigarette butts,
correct,
lip of a Coca-Cola can,
yes,
and surfaces that we touch, such as counter, doorknob, keyboards.
yes,
And you would agree that a person's DNA at a crime scene doesn't necessarily mean the person was involved in the crime?
Objection, because that's an argument, that's argumentative.
The objection is sustained.
Would you agree that the location of a DNA profile on a particular piece of clothing doesn't necessarily mean that the person ever actually touched that clothing?
So in regards to touching
Judge,
an item,
I do object, because that is vague and ambiguous.
The objection is sustained.
Would you agree that DNA can and does transfer?
in certain circumstances it can transfer.
Okay. You know, I noticed yesterday when you were handling the blue jeans, you asked to take them out and you're going to put them on the table. You asked for something to place them on, correct?
Yes,
And that was to prevent contamination, correct?
it's more, at this point it's more for the protection of what I'm placing, the item that I'm placing on the table. I didn't want to get it dirty in a sense. I didn't want anything from that item to spill onto the table, or at least try to prevent that.
You would agree that working on, if you're doing DNA testing or handling items that may be tested for DNA later, it would be appropriate to place something on a table before placing the item you're going to be testing on. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
And that's to avoid any type of transfer from DNA that may be on the table onto the item you're going to be testing. Is that correct?
That's fair to say.
What's touch DNA?
So touch DNA is basically just that. When an item or a person is touched, and that person that's doing the touching may leave behind some of their DNA. In regards to DNA, our type of DNA testing, for touch DNA, normally we have to see either prolonged or forceful contact for us to get results from touch DNA.
Would you agree that a nanogram or less is considered to be an optimal amount of DNA for testing?
So in regards to what we would target for our procedures, we can get DNA from less than a nanogram.
Okay, and a nanogram, if we were to have a little 1 gram packet of sugar, and we were to assume that there's 1,000 individual granules, to obtain a nanogram, you'd need to take one of those crystals, divide that by 1,000, then take one of those pieces, divide that by 1,000, and then one of those pieces and divide that by 1,000?
I'm not sure about that analogy.
How much is a nanogram then?
I don't know how to define it. It's a unit of measure that we utilize during our DNA processing.
Would you agree that, again, if we had 1,000 crystals of sugar in a gram packet, it's far less than one of those grams?
Check.
One of those crystals.
And again, that may cause for speculation based on the previous answer.
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
been holding this pen for the last 2 days. Would you agree that there's a fair probability that my DNA profile is on this pen?
Objection calls for speculation, Your Honor.
The objection is sustained. You may rephrase the question if you wish.
Would you agree that touch DNA can be transferred by a handshake from one person to another and then to an object like a knife or a gun?
It is possible, but like I said, in my experience, it's touchy DNA. For us to get results with our type of testing, it's either prolonged or forceful contact that has to occur.
Well, are you aware of research that has found touch DNA analysis can erroneously implicate a person who has never lived?
Objection, Your Honor. This is argumentative. Is counsel making a statement before the jury at this time?
I'm asking about research.
I object to that because it's not been brought before. Right now, he's just making a bald-faced statement in front of the jury.
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Are you aware of research done with regards to touch DNA?
I know that there are papers written about touch DNA.
Okay. And are you aware of touch DNA in those papers showing people being implicated?
Objection, Your Honor. Unless he's going to produce a paper specifically, I do object to counsel
Objection is
making an
sustained.
argument. Thank you.
People collecting multiple items of evidence at a crime scene do not change their clothes between items. The samples can be cross-contaminated. Is that fair to say?
You know, again, it calls for speculation what could happen.
The objection is sustained.
Why do you change your gloves every time you handle a different piece of evidence?
So when I'm processing evidence, I actually change my gloves multiple times, even when I'm processing the same item of evidence. And that's to prevent contamination or transfer of DNA from objects. Because I may be utilizing a camera, I may be using the keyboard on a computer. So I'm trying to prevent any transfer of DNA.
Going back to the gray sweatshirt, Q6, you said that you obtained a DNA profile from, that one was the one that was just limited to 2 donors, correct? It wasn't 2 or more? I misstated that earlier.
Okay, so the gray sweater or sweatshirt, the sample that was taken from the collar, armpit, and cuff areas.
Yes.
My conclusion was a partial DNA profile consistent with a mixture of 2 individuals was obtained from the sample.
And that conclusion, you're very specific about the words you use in the report, is that fair to say?
Yes.
And so that was a determination that there were only 2 contributors to that profile, correct?
Correct.
As opposed to the genes, which was 2 or more, correct?
Correct.
And you made that distinction intentionally, correct?
Correct.
And again, Mr. Capobianco was excluded from being a contributor to the DNA profile located on the sweatshirt.
That's been asked and answered, Your Honor.
The objection is sustained.
Did you compare the DNA detected on Q6, the gray sweatshirt, to the DNA detected on Q1, the waistband of the blue jeans?
No, I did not.
Now, on Q6, at D21S11, you see a 29 marker, right?
I'm sorry, counsel, what you referring to?
So which item of evidence was this again?
This would be the gray sweatshirt,
Sweatshirt, okay.
sample Q6, which excluded Stephen Capobianco's profile.
Okay, I'm looking at the profile now.
Okay, so one of the loci is D2 1S11, is that correct?
Oh, yes.
And that at that location on Q6 there was a 29.
At the genetic location marked D21S11,
Yes.
the genetic characteristics observed were a 29 and a 30.
On the Q6, correct? We're talking about
On the gray sweater,
right?
yeah.
And at that same location on the blue jeans, albeit with one of your asterisks, there was also a 29, correct?
So in regards to,
The same location,
so D21S11 on sample,
Q1 of the blue jeans, just the waist band.
okay, so what was the question?
There's also, albeit with an asterisk, there's also a 29 at that location, correct?
There is a 29 genetic characteristic there.
Okay. And Mr. Capobianco does it. That's not his genetic characteristic at that location, correct?
At that location, Stephen Capobianco has a 31.2.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that the determination of what items are to be tested is based on discussions between you and the detectives?
Generally, yes.
Okay. With respect to the instant case, were you ever asked to conduct any testing on a knit glove?
And the what case?
On this case,
Okay.
were you ever asked to do any testing on a knit glove?
Not that I recall.
Do you recall a knit glove ever being brought to your attention?
No.
Okay. Again, with respect to the instant case, were you ever asked to conduct any tests on a black ski mask?
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
Read your examination.
And can we take a break? We've been going like an hour and a half.
That is in recess.